Hello and welcome to Introduction to Psychology 1. We're beginning week 1. Now there's a couple things I'll just mention here is that each week we're going to do a similar chapter. I'm going to divide the chapter kind of in half and then provide it in week 1 and then the second part in week 2. And what we're going to be doing this week is look at what is psychology and what separates psychology as a science from what is psychology as common sense. And we're going to look at sort of how it becomes a science, and therefore we're going to look at the scientific method and sort of the foundation of the research and how it is that psychology is a science and what separates it from common sense. And then in week 2 we'll look at theorists, and I'll post week 2 in week 2 folder. Alright, so take your time, go through this video, remember to pause it from time to time if you need to make notes. Underline in your textbook, use sticky notes to remind you where things are so that when it comes to test time you have your preparation material available for you, so when you sit down to do the test you're not hunting for stuff and looking through your textbook for information, which wastes an awful lot of time. Okay, so let's get on with the beginning of what is psychology.
Alright, we're going to look at a quick little survey I'd like you to try. It's just to sort of demonstrate the difference between psychology as a science and what we assume to be common sense material. So go through this and answer true or false. I'd like you to just put it on pause and then I'll get started again. Okay, now I hope you did put it on pause and I hope you're completed now. Now, just for the sake of doing this, all the even are true, all the odd are false. Now the point of this is just to demonstrate that there's many things that we take for granted as being, this is what I understand, this is the way the world is, this is what psychology is all about. And I hope it demonstrated a little bit that not everything is common sense, that there's science that tells us something about the world around us, and in particular about psychology and about people, that's more accurate because it's based on facts. So let's jump ahead and look at our basic introduction into what is psychology and the like. So when we think about psychology, by definition, psychology is the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. Now it's a scientific study, and so it's got a methodology to it. And the method it uses is called the scientific method. It's orderly, it's systematic, it's procedural, and they follow a basic guideline. Now this is a simplified version, is that you identify a research problem, you design a study and investigate that research problem, you collect and analyze data, you draw conclusions, and you communicate your findings. Now I'm going to break this down, or I'm going to go through a little bit more detail in a minute. Okay, so now what's really important here is these steps help generate the facts that are behind psychology as a science and the theories that we'll talk about in week 2. So let's look at these steps a little more carefully.
Okay, so what we're looking at here is what are the steps to the scientific method. And when we look at what we've got here, I've broken it down into a series of steps. So we have it almost like a process. And we begin with you make observations of the world around you and you make a theory, or you theorize. You make an educated guess about that observation that you've made. Now many people who go into research, whether it's medical, biological, psychology, sociological, often have a personal experience involved. Maybe someone they know has been affected by some sort of condition, and as a result they've observed something that is a challenge or a difficulty. And then they make a theory, if you will, an educated guess about what they think would improve that situation for a loved one or someone they know, or things that they've seen. So the next is to formulate a hypothesis. That is to say, well, what will happen if I did this change for this person or this group of people? And you make an educated guess about that. You usually write it out in a statement. And then you design a study. How am I going to test that out? So the third step is design the study, and then once you've designed the study, you've made sure that you're protecting it from your bias, what you think you should be getting, and what you want to see as a result. and you design it in a way that is reliable and valid. Then you start to collect the data. You run the experiment, you collect the data, and then you apply the results to the hypothesis. You use it as a comparison. How well did the research go to explain or give me support of my hypothesis, or did my research find out that my hypothesis was wrong? Now in research, it doesn't matter whether you're right or wrong. Either way is good data. So if my hypothesis is wrong, I didn't get the data that supported it, then that's equally as important as getting data that supports my hypothesis. And then lastly is you need to replicate it. And so one way you do that is you share your results with others who can then look at that results, go and replicate the experiment, and see if they get similar results. Therefore, building in more validity and more reliability. Therefore, over a period of time, you develop a theory.
Now, a theory, as the sunglasses suggest, are different perspectives of the world using data to look at the world. Now, in our case, we're looking at these mental processes and behaviors, and sunglasses would be the research that I've done, and I've done using the scientific method, have suggested this about the way we develop our sense of sight or how we perceive the world around us, where somebody else will have used different tests, different means of measurement to ask the same question and came up with different results, and therefore they're like looking at the same mental process using a different set of glasses. So a theory is a general principle or set of principles proposed to explain how a number of separate facts are related. Now there's more than one way to view these sets of facts and how they are related, and that's what theories are, and that's why there's more than one theory. Now what's important with any piece of research is, one, the more pieces of research you develop that say similar things, the stronger your theory comes. Now, one way to strengthen your theory and to refine your theory is to replicate. And this is the process of repeating a study with different participants. So if I was studying intelligence and studying it with college students A from this college, I would then repeat the same experiment with another group of randomly sampled college students from a different college. And if I get the same kind of results, then that's strengthening my theory. And even better than just me repeating my own research is to have a different investigator, a different researcher, do that research over again to see if they can verify the research findings. Now, psychology has 4 goals. This is really what psychology is aiming to accomplish in the research that's being done. They first want to describe things. They want to tell what occurs as accurately and as completely as possible. They want to describe and make a description. So when we're talking about memory, they want to be able to describe what is memory. So they want to be able to do research to see what is it as completely as possible. And that's why when we come to the section on memory, you may learn some things about memory you didn't otherwise know. It's because of the description of how that process of memory works, or how does vision help in our perception of the world? How do we perceive the world? And we'll look at that in our next chapter. The second goal is that of explanation. An understanding of conditions confirmed by using or by ruling out or ruling in alternatives. So an explanation is looking at what are the ways that we can say we can explain how something happens or when, under what circumstances it happens, by ruling out things that don't apply and ruling in those things that do apply. And so we start to make some explanation of cause and effect in some cases. Prediction is an important next step, and this is where we try to identify all the antecedent conditions. Now, antecedents are the things that precede a particular behavior. And so antecedent conditions would be what sorts of things precede success. What do people who are successful do to be successful? And so those would be antecedent effects. And we could make some predictions to say that if you too wanted to be successful, here are some of the things that you would need to do for that to occur. And then influence would be the last goal. And this is where we would be applying principles to prevent unwanted occurrences or to bring about desired outcomes. If you wanted to be a happier person, then what sorts of things would we be able to say through our research in psychology that are, here are the things that you should do to become happier, and here's the things that you should avoid doing that would move you towards unhappiness. So the goal in psychology, the goals are important in terms of it drives a lot of the research that goes on, and then a lot of the discovery that goes on in psychology is based on these goals. Now, in terms of psychology as a science, there's two types of research that all subjects that do research follow either one of these two. And one is called basic and the other is applied research. And so what is your research good for? Well, basic research is conducted to seek new knowledge. It's discovery. And to explore and advance general scientific understanding. So if we're doing basic research, it's following curiosity. It's looking at, the why, the what, and the how. There's no really any other sort of purpose. There's not like a commercial value to doing the research. Basic research is for discovery, looking for new information, and advancing existing understandings. Now, on the contrary, if you're doing applied research, you're conducting research specifically to solve a practical problem or to improve the quality of life. And so if we're doing research on memory, maybe we're going to apply this research to students to enable them to be better at gaining an education and remembering important facts and important skills for the future of their professional life. And so applied research sometimes have a specific commercial significance. This might be a product that would be sold. So when we look at research, it's either basic or applied. Now, we're going to look at also a variety of different ways to do research. And there's a form of descriptive research. We have naturalistic observation. This is where researchers observe and record behavior in its natural setting without influencing or controlling it. Now, what I used to do for 20 years was behavior consulting, and part of what I did was naturalistic observations. If I was doing some work with children and I needed to go to a daycare to observe a child, the naturalistic observation was to go to the daycare, sit somewhere, and just record what I saw. Researchers will, observe and record behavior in the natural setting and trying not to influence it at all. Well, in a daycare, it's kind of hard not to be somewhat a part of it, but you try not to influence, and you have to learn very tough skills on how to write unbiasedly. Laboratory. This laboratory observation is behavior that's studied in a laboratory setting, allowing more control or use of precise instruments. In university, I volunteered for many scientific pieces of research at the school from psychology students, and I remember one where they were testing for sleep cycles and dreaming, and so you'd come into a lab. You'd be hooked up to some wires and some breathing measuring tools, and you'd go to sleep at the university in a laboratory, and they would observe you on TV cameras and wake you up when you were having rapid eye movement and recording your respiration, your heart rate, and a variety of other instruments were measuring. So this is observed in a controlled environment. They didn't come to your house and watch you sleep. You go to a lab and you sleep. You do that if you're looking at people who want to get investigated for sleep apnea and the likes. They go to a lab to be tested. Case study is another way of gathering research information. Now, this is a little different. This isn't gathering information on a lot of people. This is looking at a single person or a very small number of people, and you're studying that person at great depth. Now, the book that's there is Three Faces of Eve, and this was essentially a case study done of Eve, who was a person with multiple personalities. and she had 3 personalities. And so with the extensive work on her history, any conditions that may have predicted or were precursors to developing alternative personalities, how her life was lived with these, what other influences in her life may have explained, how did she cope, did she get cured, and if so, what influences happened. This is an extensive case study. And that's one way that we get depth of information about somebody or some condition. When Colonel Russell Williams, the commander at a Canadian base, was charged with murder, they did an extensive bit of background on him to determine what were the predictors. Could this have been predicted? How did he, avoid being recognized? So they did a case study. And that's how they would, gather more information to help protect against this occurring again. And then lastly, other research methods include survey research. And maybe you've been asked to do a survey. You've gone to the mall and someone's approached you to ask if you could take 10 minutes to answer some questions. These would be interviews or questionnaires that are used to gather information about attitudes, beliefs, experiences, behaviors of different groups of people. Maybe you received a phone call to do a Angus Reid poll or a political poll to answer questions. And this is all about gathering research information to help understand and take a pulse, if you will, of how people feel about certain things. Now, part of the development of research in doing descriptive research is including gathering people to be participants in your research. And there's 3 primary terms here. One is population. This is the entire group of people that you're interested in, or that researchers are interested in, to which they generalize their findings. So if I wanted to do research on nurses, my population would be nurses. And the sample that I would take would be part of that population that is studied in order to reach a conclusion about the entire population. And so if we look at the entire population of nurses and we find that nurses have a wide range in age, they have a gender differences, there's cultural variations in that population, then my sample needs to have a similar diversity as does the general population. So I need to have the same sort of distribution of age, sex, culture, experience, as does the general population in my sample. And then a representative sample is a sample that mirrors the population of interest, includes subgroups in the same population as found in the population. That's a lot more specific sample group. Now, there is another method of research. It's called correlational. And I'm going to try to go through this as carefully as I can. This is sometimes a little difficult to understand. Correlational, it expresses the relationship between 2 variables. It doesn't show cause and effect. You don't say that this is caused by that in a correlational method. Correlational research looks to explain the phenomenon by looking at other factors that occur along with the phenomenon. So why do students drop out of college? Well, is there one cause and effect? No. What factors might influence this decision? That would be the correlational method, finding what other factors influence it. Is it employment? Is it stress? Is it missing home? Is it distance from home? There's a lot of variables that can influence that. Correlational describes the strength of relationship between 2 or more variables. In other words, it explains how likely is it that you'll find the 2 variables together. Student dropout rate and feelings of isolation are highly correlated. So when students feel isolated, there's a greater risk of dropping out, but it's not a cause and effect. As the example I have in the slide, as more ice cream is eaten, more people are murdered. Does ice cream cause murder? Or does murder cause people to eat ice cream? It's not a cause and effect. Okay, it's about a relationship, and that's what correlational is. Now, I'll try to give you some brief examples here. There's a positive correlation, negative correlation, and there's no correlation. And you see the 3 diagrams. You have The positive correlation, there's an increase in one variable which leads to an increase of another. As the hours of studying increase, so do test marks. That's a positive correlation. Whereas a negative correlation is you have a decrease in one variable which leads to an increase in another. So you have, in that example, as hours of partying increase, test marks decrease. That would be a negative correlation. And then no correlation would be you can increase or decrease one variable and it seems to have no influence on the other at all. As students eat more peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, test marks neither increase or decrease. When we use the correlational coefficient to identify how strongly linked two variables are. Now what I didn't show here, and I'll just highlight briefly, is that it ranges from a -1 to 0 to a +1, and it shows that there's a variable strength of that relationship. This means that variables can be positively or negatively correlated. So it's main thing to remember here is that it doesn't represent cause and effect. It represents strength of relationship of occurrence. Okay? Now the experimental method also includes two things here. When the experimental method is being used, this is not correlation. When the experimental method is being used, this is the only research method to identify cause and effect relationships between two or more variables. You have the independent variable and dependent variable. Now, what's important about these two variables is that when you create your research, you want to create a hypothesis that makes a prediction about cause and effect, the relationship between two or more variables. The cause being the independent variable. The independent variable is the factor or condition that you are deliberately manipulating to determine whether it causes change in another behavior. So if I'm going to be doing a bit of research on stress, and I'm going to measure stress by heart rate, respiration, and blood pressure, and then I think that meditation is going to play a big role in being able to keep someone in a de-stressed environment or de-stressed condition, then the independent variable, the thing that I'm going to manipulate, is adding meditation. So I'm going to have the independent variable meditation. The dependent variable will be any condition or factor that can be manipulated or controlled or measured. Well, I can measure heart rate, I can measure respiration, I can measure blood pressure. So that's my dependent variable. And so if I can measure it, it's the dependent. If I can't measure it, but it's the thing I'm going to use, my treatment, my piece of research that I want to test to see if it's going to make a difference, that's my independent variable. And then with the experimental method, and we have the independent variable and dependent variable, we also have an experimental group and control group. The experimental group is the group that we're going to add the independent variable. This is the group we're going to teach how to use meditation and have them use it for a month every day, and we'll see what that does to the dependent variables of heart rate, blood pressure, and heart rate. The control group, well, they won't get the independent variable. They'll go about their daily life as they always have for a month, and we'll check their variables, their dependent variables as well, and we'll see if there's any difference by comparison between the experimental group and the control group. So the experimental group is exposed to the independent variable, or the thing that you're changing, you're manipulating. The control group, which is a very similar group to the experimental group, is exposed to the same experimental environment, but they're not given the independent variable, and we use this for comparison to find out if my independent variable made a difference. Now when we look at research, there's some sources of bias, and we have to protect about this. We have to protect about selection of bias. If I'm doing research on health, I can't just go out and select healthy people. That would be selection bias. So there needs to be a way that we can randomly assign people. So there's no predictability to which participants go to which group, for example, experimental or control, or which people are selected, period. And so we use random assignment as one way to protect that. Now we could also see the impact of placebo effect, that if people think they're going to get the good manipulated experience, then that may influence the outcome of of the experiment by what they expect will happen. Experimenter bias is if I try to influence the healthy group, maybe it's decision making, and I want to demonstrate how people make good decisions. If I present the material as saying, well, you can have this glass of orange juice or this bottle of beer, I've indicated in the way that I've said it is that I prefer you to take the glass of orange juice. That if I bias you that way and you continue and people continue to choose orange juice, then I've got experimental bias involved. And that's a very oversimplified example, but experimenter bias has to be protected. And the way you do that is what's called a double-blind procedure. This is where the experimenters and the researchers and the participants don't know which group they're in, and don't know who's getting the independent variable. So it's double blind is to say the participants and the researchers both don't know. Okay, and lastly is that there are issues that we need to do to protect participants that participate in research. There's the legality. We have to make sure that we're not putting people in a illegal position, like causing them to behave in illegal ways, or that the contracts, the agreements that we're having people to participate in are above board and legal. That there's institutional approval. You can't do research on employees without having the institution's approval of them being participants. Informed consent. People can't participate without giving informed consent that I'm agreeing to be a part of the research. Plus, they have a right to leave at any time that they want. You can't force them to remain in. As far as deception, there's a limit to what degree of deception you can do. And there's been examples of, the Milgram experiment, with the Stanford experiment, where the level of deception was high and the level of risk was higher. And then debriefing. Debriefing is essentially, once the participants have participated, is that they are debriefed. They are talked to after the fact and ensure that they've not been negatively affected, know what kind of research they were in and what the outcomes of the research were. Okay, there we are. Week 1, Intro to Psychology 1, complete. Now please take the time to go back over the material any number of times you need. Pause the video, make notes, use sticky notes in your book. Be prepared so that when the test comes around, you've got resources available for you to use already ready, and you don't have to go thumbing through your book looking for answers. Okay? I hope this has been helpful. Good luck, and we'll see you again. Bye now.